Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to start with a little bit of a rant. So, incoming. I cannot stand figurine chess notation and descriptive notation. Like algebraic should be the only option. So, figurine notation, it's an option on the online sites and in some books. It's where there's a figure. It's just that it's like a diagram instead of the piece, whether it's rook, king, knight, whatever it is. So if it's like rook to e5, it'll have a picture of a rook and then e5. If it's bishop to h1, whatever it is, it'll have a picture of the bishop. Can't stand it. And then, of course, descriptive notation, which was the old standard for a while, like pawn to king 4, pawn to queen bishops 4. I don't know how people read that. Algebraic, with letters, like for knight e5, n e5. Like if a pawn moves, e4. If a bishop moves, use a b. The figurine and descriptive notation has to go. I can't stand, I don't know why it bothers me, but there's just something about the figurine especially that it just drives me crazy. So I would just put it out there that algebraic with letters should be the standard, should be the only option. It more or less is. But some books and some things online, they use the figurine notation, which again, kind of drives me crazy. So just a little rant there. And going to the club, it was interesting. Last week, we had a number of upsets. And the reason I'm mentioning this, don't ever get intimidated because your opponent is higher rated. I mean, we all know that. But the point I really want to make is that those higher rated club players, those players who were, say, 17, 18, 1900, even 2000, they can easily play very badly at any given moment. I've mentioned this before. That's a big thing that Jeremy Silman has said as well. So you might be rated 1400. See, this is the typical scenario that I see at the club and elsewhere. You might be rated, say, 1400, and you sit down and you see your opponent's rated 1800. And what happens is that 1400 player is already mentally beat before the game even starts because it's like, wow, this guy's rated 1800. How am I going to win? But you'd be surprised how poorly they play or how many mistakes they made. But if you sort of have this attitude like, I'm wasting my time, there's no way I can beat this guy, well, then that will probably happen. But if you believe that you have a shot and you play really well and solidly in good fundamental chess, it's very possible that your higher rated opponent might be the one to make the mistake. So these types of upsets happen all the time. Common and elementary blunders from these players happen more often than you think. But the bottom line is, don't let your opponent's rating intimidate you. So we had a player rated 934 drew a 1300 player, and a player rated 960 beat a 1600 player. But a couple of things to be fair here. You'll notice it was 1300 and 1600 exactly. So whenever you see those two zeros at the end of the rating, that's most likely a rating floor. And rating floors exist, obviously, to prevent sandbagging. But I think in a lot of ways there's an overcorrection, because if you have someone who's just going to the club who's clearly not going to sandbag, if their listed rating is, say, 1600, because that's their floor, but they're really playing at, let's say, 1500 or 1400 level strength, that kind of messes up the system, because you're going to get credit for playing a 1600, but if they're really 1400 strength, I think the rating floors, it kind of goes too far, and you have people who are at their floor for years or the rest of their life. I mean, still, even though their opponents were in the 900s, that's still an accomplishment, because let's say the 1600 player was really 1400. If a 960 beat him, there's still something to be said for that. If the 1300 player is really rated, let's say 1100, there's something to be said for that. But then there's also the argument that once you get below 1400 or even 1300, there's not much of a difference. So you could argue in the, say, 800 to 1300 range, that's all more or less the same. There's not too much of a difference. Whereas the difference between a 1400 player and an 1800 player, that's a much, much bigger difference. It's sort of like saying the difference in maturity between, let's say, a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old, or a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old. That's huge. But the difference between a 45 and a 50-year-old, it's probably negligible. That type of thing, maybe that's not the best analogy, but you get the idea. So I think the lower you go, the less drastic the difference in rating. As you go higher, there's definitely a big difference. For example, I think there could be a very big difference between a 1500 player and a 1700 player, but maybe not so much between a 900 and an 1100. But the bottom line is, don't overestimate your higher rated opponent, because these upsets happen all the time. I mean, we've had some crazy upsets at the club over the years. Very, very interesting. And now let's jump into the mailbag. Our first message is from Paul. He says, I'm still really enjoying the podcast. It's become part of my routine on the way to club games, and it gets me into the zone. I was wondering if you could share some detailed insights on chess etiquette. For example, I recently learned by watching Levy versus Pia that eating at the board is considered bad etiquette. That made me realize there are probably other things I don't know. For instance, is it okay to stand and think instead of sitting at the board, or is that considered rude? At the moment, I'm thinking it is okay as long as my opponent doesn't object. It would be great to hear your perspective as both a tournament director and an experienced player on the topic in general. A more specific and related question: when I'm in a clearly losing position, I often speed up but keep playing, hoping for a stalemate or making sure my opponent knows the basic mates, like rook versus king, before I resign. I feel this is reasonable since I'm not dragging the game out, but in a recent match, my opponent seemed annoyed. I know it's within the rules, but since we're all playing for fun, I don't want to come across as disrespectful. What's your take on this? For context, I'm around 1500. Thank you very much for your insights, and I hope you win your next game. Well, thanks, Paul, for the kind words about the pod. I appreciate it. Now, as far as chess etiquette, yeah, we got into that a bunch last week when we were talking about playing kids. It's a recurring theme on the podcast. Now, yeah, generally eating at the board is considered poor etiquette. Now, there's eating at the board and eating at the board. If your opponent is sort of quietly eating a protein bar, or maybe they have a bag of almonds, like if it's sort of like a quiet type of snack, it's not like greasy or messy, that's probably okay. I mean, I've done that myself where I'll have a protein bar, but I'll just kind of break it into pieces and I'm kind of quiet about it. I think that's okay. Most of us can probably deal with that. But if you're sitting at the table with like a greasy slice of pizza or some type of, hot takeout food that has a strong aroma and it's like greasing it, yeah, obviously you would need to step away from the board for that. That wouldn't be appropriate. But like I said, kind of a dry snack or a piece of fruit, something like that, that's probably okay. I don't really think that's an issue. I mean, obviously, if it's somehow making noise or if it has a strong aroma or if it's distracting, that would be a different story. Now, you mentioned, is it okay to stand and think instead of sitting at the board? Is that considered rude? It depends on who you talk to. I have very strong feelings about that. I personally feel that that is not appropriate. Players who will stand over the board for a long period of time, if that's my opponent, I will say something. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm not talking about if it's a tricky position and let's say my opponent just wants to stand up for a minute to kind of glance at it. He stands up for maybe 30 seconds or so and sits down. I'm fine with that. Or if he's getting up, he kind of walks by the board, stands, and then goes away for, after a bit. That type of thing is okay. I've even done that myself. But if my opponent is standing for an extended period of time over the board, I do consider that distracting behavior, and I will say something. Okay, I'll just say, can you please sit or step away from the board? Most of the time, they'll comply. I've had people kind of look at me like strange, and again, I don't try to be confrontational, but I'll just say, look, it's distracting. I'm trying to study the board as well, and you're kind of like standing over it. It's like, have a seat. I will say something. Now, other people are not going to get bothered by that. It really depends, and it depends on the situation. Now, what some people will do is when they're standing over the board and they're standing over the board. I've had opponents or I've seen players at tournaments I direct, they'll stand over the board, like hands on the table, like leaning in. And I'm like, you can't do that. You're not going to sit there and just stand there for like however many minutes while you're thinking. It's distracting. I've had players where they'll attempt to stand for the entire game. As a TD, it depends. I mean, if it's clearly not bothering the opponent and they're not asking for a ruling, I try not to interfere. But if I notice them doing it for an extended period of time, I will go over and I'll say, just when you're at the board, can you have a seat, please? That type of thing. And it's hard because in some cases it is distracting to the opponent, but they don't want to say something. Now, if you're playing me and you're standing up over the board for an extended period of time, I am going to say something politely and respectfully, but I am going to say something. And like I said, most of the time my opponents comply, but I personally, again, this is sort of a judgment call. I do consider that, I don't want to say rude, but I consider it distracting behavior. And by definition, distracting behavior is not acceptable. And that's always going to be subjective as far as the player and the TD. But I'll put it this way. If someone calls me over as a TD and says, can you please ask him to sit? He's been standing the whole game. I will say, yes, at the board, you do need to sit down. I'll say, look, if you want to stand up for a moment, I get it, but you can't stand up over the board for an extended period of time because it is distracting. Now, that's how I feel. Other people are going to listen to this and say, really? Like your opponent standing up, that bothers you? And I get it. It's really to each his own, but that is, those, I should say, are my feelings as a player and a TD. All right, because it is sort of this, like, I don't want to call it like a power pose, but there is just something that I find very distracting about it. And I don't think it's proper etiquette if you're standing up for the entire game or an extended period of time. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Paul. Now, your other question about when you're in a losing position. Now, you say you speed up but keep playing. I mean, I'm not sure why you do that. If you really want to look for the win and look for a swindle, you should probably slow down and look for an annoying move that's going to make your opponent think or trip them up. Now, what a swindle is, for those of you who don't know, a swindle is basically a tricky or sneaky move you make. It's like a trappy move you make in a losing position, and you hope your opponent sort of falls for it. So a swindle, it's generally an unsound move, but it has a very tricky, trappy, intimidating nature to it. And if your opponent falls for it, you can turn the table. So it's kind of a risky, unsound move that you make in a losing position with the hope of turning the tables. So that's basically what a swindle is. So if you're in a losing position, but you want to turn around, playing faster is probably not the best thing to do. Now, you said you're rated about 1,500, and you say you want to make sure your opponent knows the basic mates. So I'm assuming you're talking about like you have a lone king and he is a rook and a king. Well, I would say this. If your opponent is much lower rated or is maybe like a beginner or something, or, well, not a beginner, but let's say maybe an advanced beginner. Like, let's say you're playing a much lower rated opponent. I mean, 1,500 is a strong rating, but let's say whatever. Let's say you're having a bad night. We've all been there. If your opponent's much lower rated, I don't blame you for playing on, because yes, there is a chance they might mess the mate up, but you're 1,500. I mean, if you're playing someone who's rated higher than that, and it's like king and rook versus king, yeah, it's probably unsportsmanlike to continue. I mean, people do, but you would probably resign. I mean, if I'm playing someone 200, 300, 400 points higher than I am, and it's king and rook versus king, I'm just going to tip my king because, unless their clock is about to fall. That would be the exception. If you're in a losing position, but their clock is about to fall, but even then I would probably resign, because if there's an increment, which there will be if I play, because I'll only play if there's an increment, that's going to give them enough time to win. So even they could have like 15 seconds left, but if they're playing with like a 10-second or 30-second increment, they're going to know the mate against me. So I would say if you're clearly losing, and when I say losing, I don't mean that you're down a pawn. I mean that you're like clearly worse. If your opponent's much lower rated, I think it's okay to play on because it's reasonable to think that they might mess something up. If you're playing a stronger, higher rated opponent, it's probably best to resign. But of course, it is your right to continue and play on until someone is checkmated. Everybody has the right to continue for the win. So I'll leave it up to you, but those are my thoughts on that. But thanks again, Paul. Really good questions. Our next message is from Charlie, who bought us a coffee on our Buy Me a Coffee page. You can check that out if you want to support the show. There's a link in the show notes. He also sent us an email. And Charlie writes, "Dear Neil, I have been listening to your podcast for a few months now. I totally get what you say about studying tactics. I recently purchased Chess Tactics from Scratch by Martin Wentenschink. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I set out to read it every day and completed the 12 chapters in just over 2 weeks. It was hard going at times, but I managed to do it without a board, which is what the author had intended. This does not include all the test questions at the end. Whilst grinding out the chapters in the book, I noticed my online play slipping, and in just a space of a week, I had dropped over 100 points. I then played a junior opponent last night, rated 1845. My rating just peaked, ECF 1815. Needless to say, I got beat. Very nice kid, and I was not ashamed to lose. I was listening to one of your episodes today, and what you said about tactics training making you look for tactics in real games when they are not there. This was the case for me last night." So yeah, just to say that a little bit clearer, what I was saying was, if you go crazy with a lot of these, fancy tactical puzzles, what happens is in your over the board games, you start to look for tactics and try to force a tactical shot when one's not there, and then you end up blundering. So that's what he's referring to. So anyway, he continues, "This was the case for me last night. I thought I had a tactic that traded his strong bishop for the loss of only one pawn and left my rook on the 7th rank. Midway through the tactic, I saw that I could not take back the pawn and instead had to play for a fork that traded pieces, and I lost 2 pawns in the process. But that was better than losing a whole piece and a pawn. Anyhow, I am pleased to say I played rapid today and blitz last night in bed when I couldn't sleep. I got my focus back on solely looking for my opponent's threats with one eye on my own threats and the type of endgame it may lead to. This works for me, as nearly always my opponents get frustrated and then blunder or push a bad position. Then the tactics present themselves. I still believe there is a place for studying tactics, but do you need to separate this training from real gameplay, or do I need to train more like I play? Are there any books you can recommend that talk about this? I hope you win your next game, Charlie." And he says, "I play at the Hammersmith Chess Club, West London Chess Club, and Celtic Tigers." Well, shout out to those clubs. Good questions, Charlie, and I appreciate the kind words about the pod. Now, let me take a couple of things you said there. So yes, that is a big thing with me. You have to be careful in your actual games that you're not trying to sort of engineer tactics that aren't there. And as I've said numerous times on the pod, especially in recent episodes, most of your tactical shots in your over-the-board tournament games, and I would argue even in your online games, are going to be very basic tactical shots, 1 to 3 move tactical sequences. What do I mean by that? Basically, your opponent makes a move and he hung a piece and you just take it. Or your opponent makes a move where it's a 2-move tactic, like you take, he takes, and then bam, you take and you win a piece. Most of the time, it's going to be simple like that. It's going to be based on a pin. It's going to be a forking idea. It's going to be a back rank mate idea. And most of the time, these tactics are going to occur because your opponent either just blundered based on his rating. He made maybe he's lower rated and made typical mistakes for that rating bracket, or maybe they were in time pressure and they blundered for that reason. Or it could be that you just had a better position or an attack, and in the course of defending, you had a tactical shot. Because remember, most tactics are based on some type of double threat. So maybe you have a mating attack, he makes a move that stops the mate, but then it allows a tactical shot. So that's the whole idea. You're threatening mate and to win material, and he can't defend both. Obviously, he has to prioritize and choose defending against mate, and then you have a tactical shot. So most of the time, these like really complicated 5, 6, 7, 8 move combinations that you might study in a course online or something like that, those generally are not going to appear in your actual games. Or if they do, if the opportunity exists, it's going to be very, very difficult to find and for you to execute properly. You know, that's a problem is people, they'll go into a complicated line and over the board game, they'll correctly play the first move of the sequence, but then they don't know how to finish it out. And it's the type of thing, you now enter this tricky tactical sequence. You basically have to play the one and only correct move every time for the next 7 moves, or you're losing. And then when you played online, like Rapid and Blitz, like you just look for your opponent's threats and keep an eye on your own threats. That's really what it's about. Just make solid moves, be aware of your opponent's threats, be aware of your threats. Like you said, let your opponent be the one to get frustrated and blunder. I mean, many, many chess games are won that way, where it's kind of a boring position and you just keep playing solid moves and your opponent sort of tries too hard to win and ends up losing. Like what I see online when I play online is they'll go for like a pawn storm or something like that, or some type of pawn attack when they haven't fully developed. And they usually end up either allowing my pieces to get on really good squares, or I just start an attack, or I start a tactical thing. So whenever my opponent's not fully developed and they push pawns, I always say, okay, wait a minute, there might be something there, look for it. You know, that's sort of an oversimplified example, but that's kind of what you're saying, and I totally get that. Now, your last question is an excellent thought experiment. This is a really interesting thing you say. You say, do you need to separate this training from real gameplay, or do you need to train more like you play? I think it's a little bit of both, okay? You have to realize that when you're actually playing a game, you have to play the position in front of you. Like, what are your responsibilities in this particular position? All right. And yes, you can train that way as well, but you can also just do regular tactical puzzles as well. But I think the main shift, I mean, this is just for me how I do it. When you're playing an actual game, you do kind of need to separate that from your training, because some of the things you trained might not apply in that position. In other words, you always have to look at the particular position in front of you. And you can't say, okay, well, I studied this thing and I want to apply it here because I feel like it. You can't do that. You have to say, okay, what is this particular position in front of me calling for? Now, you might dip into your training and refer to it for that, but you can do both. You can just do exercises, but you can also train like you play. Now, as far as a book where you can train like you play, that would be Practical Chess Exercises by Ray Chang. I've mentioned that before in the pod numerous times. What that book is, it's a puzzle book, but what's unique about it, and I'm always amazed that there aren't more books like this, each puzzle is not necessarily a tactical shot. It could be a defensive move. It could be a waiting move. It could be a positional idea. What's great about that book, though, he doesn't tell you what it is. So in other words, it's mixed. Some of it's tactics, some of it's positional, some of it is the correct answers, like a slow, quiet move or a prophylaxis move, but he doesn't say which is which, and he goes back and forth. So as opposed to most puzzle books where everything is a tactical shot, like, you know, sort of white to move and win type of thing, this book is, okay, it's white to move, what's the best move? And you actually have to study the position and determine, okay, is it a tactical thing? Is it a positional thing? Is it a development thing? He doesn't give you any clue as to the type of solution it is. So for example, I think there's like 6 puzzles on a page. The first puzzle, yes, might be a tactical shot. And the second puzzle might be, okay, your best move is A3, just keeping his piece off that square. Or your best move is to retreat the knight so that you can move the pawn in front of it as a lever. And you don't know which is which. And that's how actual games happen, right? When you're in a tournament, no one's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, buddy, you got a tactical shot right here. Or, hey, buddy, you need to play positionally. Every position is different. Every move is different. In an actual tournament, you always have to constantly assess, do I need to play dynamically, statically? And that's what I like about the Ray Chang book, is because it forces you to think that way. So it's, as far as any book where you're kind of training the way you would play in a tournament, that would be the one that I recommend. But excellent questions, Charlie. Thanks so much for checking in, and I appreciate the coffee. Our final message is from our YouTube channel. This is from @bluefin.64. He's written in before, follower of ours on YouTube. We appreciate it. And he made two very interesting points that I want to share. So he says, as a post-beginner centuries ago, a master told me to just attack if I wanted to win. In my next game, over the board, I was a piece up, but thinking I should just attack, quote unquote, I floundered around trying to whip up an attack against my opponent's king when I should have simplified. Of course, I managed to blunder, dropping a rook, and lost. In another game, I could have taken a piece for free and had a simple endgame, but I decided to go for the glory and played a flawed mating combination. I overlooked a Zweijenschuh and intermezzo and gave up a draw. I still don't like it when I overlook the best continuation, but I learned my lesson about perfectionism early. Well, that's his first point. Very well said. I agree 100%, and we've all been there. And the idea of taking the piece for free and just having a simple endgame, that works for all types of opponents, all types of time controls. I mean, I've won blitz games online that way because, we think of blitz as, you want to go for like mate and attack. But I've won many blitz games online, including my classical over the board games, just by doing a lot of trades. And, obviously I would analyze this, but I would trade down knowing that I would end up with the better endgame. And between the positional advantage of my endgame skills, I would just go on to win. And what's nice about that too, if your opponent likes attacks, that's going to drive them crazy because you're basically saying, okay, the queens are gone, the rooks are gone. We have this simple minor piece endgame, but I know that I'm better. I know the technique, and they're not going to know what to do. So yeah, if you can simplify and win, that's definitely the way to do it. And perfectionism, yeah, that's something that we all struggle with. I don't think any one of us can say that we've fully overcome it, but it's something we have to be aware of because that's a big thing. Like, oh, do I go for it here or do I simply trade down? And if you could trade down and you clearly see the path to victory, even if it's going to take more moves, that's the way to do it. He then continues. He has a comment on tactics. He says, an idea that's gaining currency these days is to do lots of easier puzzles in order to see more of the patterns. Even Jacob Agard agrees with this now, although I don't think he means you shouldn't also do harder ones. For anyone who wants to try this, Lee Chess allows you to do puzzles up to 600 points below your rating level. I think it's good to mix these with puzzles curated by strong players, usually found in books. Again, I'm in agreement 100%. And this whole idea that for tactics, you can just study basic tactics, easier puzzles in order to see the patterns. I'm getting almost obsessed with that idea because it's true. Now, I appreciate you mentioning that Jacob Agard agrees with that now, that you should just, do the simpler puzzles, see the patterns. But yeah, of course, mix in some harder ones. Absolutely. You definitely should mix in some harder ones. That's true. But you'd be surprised how just drilling regular tactical patterns really, really helps. And again, that's really what you're going to end up seeing in the overwhelming majority of your games when you do have a tactical shot. So thank you, Bluefin.64, for the comments. Keep them coming. We appreciate it. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in just a moment. And now back to the show. All right, so I'm a big fan of the London system. Now that I mention that again, the guys from the club are going to rib me about that. If you're a busy adult who doesn't have hours to memorize opening theory, which is probably 99% of you listening, but you still want something very solid and respectable that you can play as white against almost anything, the Colle system might be your new best friend. So let's define what an opening system is. I think we all know, but for the sake of thoroughness, an opening system, essentially you can use it against almost anything your opponent replies with. That's the beauty of it. It's generally not move order dependent, and a system opening is concerned with having your pieces end up on certain squares rather than specific move orders. So in other words, you're aiming for a certain setup, a certain structure, a certain formation of your pieces. And as a result, the move order is a little flexible, and as long as you end up with that structure, you're okay. And as I said earlier, you can generally use a system opening against anything your opponent throws at you, as opposed to a theoretical opening where, if your opponent plays this, well, you have to play this. Or if your opponent plays this, you have to play this, you're already losing. And with the Colle or the London, a lot of these other systems, the King's Indian attack, you can develop the same way almost every time. We're also going to touch upon the Colle Zukertort, which is a cousin of the Colle. It's a variation where you're going to have a queenside fiend kettle. We'll talk a little bit about that. Now, little disclaimer, as with all of the episodes on openings, I'm going to give you a very basic overview. This is not a chessable course. This is not a lifetime repertoire. This is not blindfold chess. We're not going to get into like move orders and like I'm going to give you a 20 move sequence. We're not going to do that. I'm not going to touch on every possible nook and cranny of the Colle system. It's an introduction, and I know this is audio only, so I want to make sure everybody can digest it. I will, of course, include some links for you to check out to start. I was looking around online. I mean, of course, there's plenty of YouTube videos, courses, but I found 2 links online about the Colle and the Colle Zukertort. It gives a very, very basic sort of almost Wikipedia-like definition of what they are, just to get you started. And of course, as you play it, you will get better at it should you decide to try it. And the Colle system is the type of thing you can learn the basics of it and start playing it in minutes. It's fairly easy to learn, but yet it's very, very solid. So don't let the whole label of a system opening fool you. A lot of people hear system opening, and that has like a pejorative term, like it's only for beginners. Not true. Even GMs have played it. And same thing with like the London system. If your opponent sort of goes on autopilot or gets cavalier or kind of spaces out, the Colle can be very dangerous. So let's talk about what the Colle system is. So the basic setup is you play D4 and then you form that triangle in the middle, similar to the London, but the only difference is that dark squared bishop is not going to be outside the pawn chain as it is with the London. So generally with the London system, it's D4, bishop F4 right away, and then E3. So when you form that triangle, the dark squared bishop's already outside of the pawn chain. With the Colle, the pawns are on D4, E3, and C3, but your bishop stays on C1. Your knights go to F3 and D2, so it's knight F3, knight BD2. White will generally castle. And then the goal in the mainline Colle is you want to break with E4. That's your goal. And what that will do, that'll help control the center, start a kingside attack, and it also opens up the line for your dark squared bishop. So that's the main idea with the Colle. And this opening, of course, is named after Belgian master Edgar Colle, not the dog. Why is this good for busy adults? And this is probably true for most system openings. You're not memorizing a ton of theory. It's about the ideas and not the move orders. The Colle is not the best against the King's Indian defense because with that bishop on D3 against the fiend kettled kingside for black, it doesn't do much. But the Colle Zukertort, which we'll talk about in a moment, that is a little bit better against the King's Indian defense. You get quick development and a safe king. You're not walking into these tactical landmines on like move 6, as you would with, some of these D4, D5 or E4, E5 openings, all right? It's great for weekend tournament players and club players, even online blitz, where you can focus more on the structure than specific moves order because, you can just simply play it at the drop of a hat. I think I mentioned this before. GM Lev Albert, in one of his books, he calls the Colle and like the London businessman openings because it's like, you bring your briefcase with this, it's obviously a metaphor. You bring this briefcase with the opening to your tournament. You open up the briefcase, you break out this opening, it gets you to the middle game, and then you put it back in your briefcase and you're done. So he jokingly called it like a businessman's opening because you can just break it out. Even if you didn't prep that much, even if you didn't study it that much that week, you can just play it at the drop of a hat. Now, your main plan in the Colle, of course, is the E4 push, right? You want to open up with E4. It opens the position. It opens up your dark squared bishop, and then you can start a kingside attack. Now, if you can't get in E4 right away, you can switch to slower positional play. You can expand on the queen side. You can maneuver for better squares. All right, remember the bishop on d3 is eyeing h7. Your knight on f3 will often hop to e5, as it does in the London sometimes. That can spearhead an attack. Your queen will often go to e2, but it will sometimes jump to f3. So what happens when your knight on f3 jumps to e5, your queen will then go to f3, and then it could slide over to h3. In some lines, it could go to h5. I mean, obviously, if black has a knight on f6, that's not going to happen, but, it could if that knight on f6 moves. So these are some different attacking ideas. You also have the idea of the rook lift. So this is assuming if you do get in e4 as white, the rook on e1 can go up and over, like it can go to like e3 and then scoot over to like the h or g file, and you can attack black's castled king. These are some different ideas. And what often happens with the Colle, because it's so solid, black will sometimes overpress, and then you could find yourself with a winning position, or you could do some trades and get a winning endgame. But again, that's just a very, very basic, oversimplified definition of what the Colle is and what the setup is, and just some of the main themes. So now let's talk about the Colle Zukertort. It's basically the same as the mainline Colle, but with a little bit of a twist. You're going to fianchetto your dark squared bishop with b3 and bishop b2. And this way, we're not as concerned with getting in e4, or if you're having trouble getting in e4, it's not as much of a concern. With the bishop on b2, you're controlling the dark squares. It can limit black's counterplay. It's a flexible pawn structure. It could lead to a kingside attack. And a lot of the ideas of the mainline Colle are there as well, like the rook lift, like where you go rook f3 and then to h3 or g3, things like that. And also with the Colle Zukertort, the c2, c4 break is a key idea for white as well. You could also get a queenside pawn majority. These are just some very, very basic ideas. Notice I'm not getting into like specific moves, because I think for audio only, that's going to get a little too unwieldy. So I just want to speak in generalities. You can check out the links that I included. That's some good basic information. And of course, there's probably plenty of videos and materials out there. For those of you who are beginners or advanced beginners, which is many of you, the Colle might be right up your alley. It's definitely something you want to check out. And like I said, you can pretty much start playing it right away. Try it in your online games, and then you can try it over the board. Now, a couple of common misconceptions about the Colle, like some might say, well, it's too passive. It's only passive if you kind of play that way. Like you really have to try to get e4 in or attack, or even though it might be passive or seem passive, that sort of solid structure is what's going to force your opponent to overpress, which is what you want. So to just kind of wrap this up, the Colle is definitely a time saver for your repertoire. It's playable, it's solid, it's easy to learn, and it's perfect for over-the-board play when you just want a very clear, familiar structure. Even for your online games, you'll simply just know what to do because you know where everything goes. You're looking for that structure. You can play it against almost anything. And if you play the London or the Tory attack or the King's Indian attack as white, you may want to try the Colle as well. And what I'll sometimes do, because people ask me, like, do you play the Colle? What I'll sometimes do after d4, if black plays c5, which I see a lot of, like d4, c5, I'll sometimes go into a Colle there, like d4, c5, I'll play e3 and then c3. Like I'll leave my dark square bishop on c1, and it'll end up transposing into a Colle structure, and I'm comfortable doing that. Because after d4, c5, if you play d5, if you push the d pawn again, which technically is like the engine approved move there, but you have to be comfortable playing those types of lines, which I generally don't like to do. So after e4, c5, I will generally not push the d pawn again. I'll either go e3, or sometimes I'll even go d takes c5. I mean, that's actually an idea that is playable, because then you're taking away some of the ideas that black might want to do if you don't recapture. And sometimes I'll go into the Colle if my opponent is expecting a London, or if somehow I feel that they prepped against it. Like there are certain opponents I know are really into the prep and others who aren't. So if I have a feeling like, I bet this guy prepped something against my London. Maybe I'll slip into a Colle. I mean, 90% of the time I play the London, but the Colle is a nice variation to have in your back pocket. So that's the Colle system. Very practical. You will often get a playable middle game every single time. And you're just looking to build a solid structure and develop and understand the main plans. If you're a busy working adult, that's what you want. So simple chess that's understood is better than complicated chess that's not understood and played poorly. At any rate, really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.